The Sealed Observatory. The brass cylinder of the great equatorial telescope was aimed at an empty void between Cygnus and Cepheus, a black, starless gulf where no light had shone for 10,000 years. Beneath its shadow lay Professor Thaddeus Vance, stone cold upon the circular cedar floorboards of the Richmond Royal Observatory. A single drop of dark venom coagulated upon the collar of his quilted velvet smoking jacket. The heavy oak door of the dome was secured from within by an unbroken 4-inch bar of forged wrought iron, dropped squarely into its steel sockets. Every casement was latched with brass wingnuts that had not turned in 20 years. And through the midnight hours, a torrential cloudburst had swept across Surrey, scouring the limestone terrace below so violently that by dawn not a single footprint, smudge, or smear remained upon the earth. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, here with you from Ohio, and tonight's story takes us to the rain-lashed outskirts of Victorian London, where science and murder meet under a locked celestial dome. It is a mystery of impossible boundaries, of an ascent made through a blinding storm, and of a dying astronomer who used his final seconds not to pray, but to leave an unalterable calculation in brass and glass. Before we begin, I want to ask you a question to ponder by the fireside. Have you ever looked at something ordinary and realized with a sudden chill that it was pointing directly at a secret? Tell me about your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Now the November gale is rattling the window panes. Let us step into Baker Street and begin. Chapter 1. The Summons to Richmond. The autumn of 1891 had descended upon London with an uncharacteristic and unrelenting ferocity. For 3 days, a southeasterly squall had driven dense sheets of rain across the capital, turning the thoroughfares into black, gleaming canals, and muffling the rumble of the four-wheelers beneath the ceaseless drumming of water upon slate roofs. The River Thames had swollen to the very lip of the embankment, its dark waters churning with yellow foam, and the yellow fog that crept through the gaslit streets carried with it the raw, bitter chill of the Essex marshes. In our rooms at 221B Baker Street, the fire had burned low, filling the sitting room with a comfortable, resinous warmth of seasoned oak logs that stood in stark defiance of the sodden gloom outside. Sherlock Holmes spent the greater part of that Tuesday afternoon cross-legged upon the Persian hearthrug, surrounded by a dozen volumes of chemical treatises, monographs upon organic alkaloids, and a row of glass retorts in which a pungent distillation of coal tar derivatives bubbled over a blue spirit lamp. His long, thin fingers moved with the delicate precision of a master watchmaker, adjusting a screw here, decanting a drop of amber liquid there, his hawk-like features illuminated by the flickering yellow glare of the hearth. For hours, neither of us had spoken a word. The only sounds in the room were the periodic hiss of the gas bracket, the steady bubbling of the chemical wash, and the distant rhythmic drumming of rain against our double window panes. I had occupied myself in the wicker armchair with a recent treatise upon gunshot wounds and nerve lesions in the Afghan frontier, yet my gaze continually drifted toward my companion. For 3 weeks, London had been remarkably quiet, a dull stagnation in the criminal world that had reduced Holmes to a state of brooding melancholy, broken only by his violent excursions into organic chemistry and occasional bursts of impassioned violin music in the small hours of the morning. His keen intellect, starved of appropriate problems, fed upon itself, turning with restless energy from crystallography to comparative pathology, and thence to the toxic secretions of tropical flora. "You see, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, holding up a glass pipette filled with a faintly iridescent violet fluid, "the alkaloids of the strychnose family possess a molecular tenacity that resists almost all standard reagents of the pharmacopoeia. A single milligram, introduced into the subcutaneous tissue, produces an immediate contraction of the motor reflexes, while leaving the sensory faculties and the cerebral cortex entirely unimpaired until asphyxia intervenes. It is a terrible agent, subtle, merciless, and leaves scarcely a trace upon the post-mortem table, save for a minute discoloration at the point of entry. If a man of intellect were to turn such a weapon to criminal ends in an isolated environment, he might present the police with a riddle that no ordinary textbook could solve. Let us hope that our criminal classes remain ignorant of toxicology, I remarked with a shudder, setting down my medical journal upon the side table. The criminal classes, my dear Watson, are generally conservative and unimaginative, Holmes said, shaking his head with a slight cynical curl of his lip. They cling to the bludgeon, the razor, and the crude arsenic of the chemist's shop. They commit their blundering outrages in public alleys or squalid garrets, leaving their muddy boot marks upon the carpets and their fingerprints upon the window-sills. It is only when the man of science falls from grace that we encounter true elegance in crime. When a scholar turns to evil, he brings to his wickedness the same patience, the same methodical deduction, and the same mastery of natural law that once served the cause of knowledge. He calculates his angles, he harnesses the weather, he turns the very instruments of truth into the engines of destruction. That is what makes him the most dangerous predator in Christendom. He held the pipette over a small porcelain evaporating dish and allowed 3 drops to fall upon a thin film of sulfuric acid. A brilliant crimson streak flashed across the white ceramic, slowly turning to a deep olive green under our eyes. A definitive reaction, Holmes murmured, recording the result in his pocket memorandum book. The presence of a curare alkaloid, combined with a cyanic radical. A poison that kills in silence, without a convulsion, freezing the breath while the mind watches its own extinction. How many murders, Watson, pass through our parish registers under the comfortable label of heart failure or apoplexy, simply because the medical practitioner lacks the chemistry to detect the needle prick beneath the collar. It was precisely 5:15 when the sharp clatter of galloping hooves broke through the monotonous rhythm of the downpour below. A cab had pulled up with violent abruptness before our door, the horse's iron shoes skidding upon the wet wooden paving of Baker Street. A moment later, the street bell jangled below with frantic energy, followed by the hurried thud of heavy boots ascending our 17 steps 2 at a time. "Ah, Watson," Holmes remarked without lifting his gaze from his pipette, "if I am not mistaken, that will be Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard. He has taken a 4-wheeler from the southwest district, paying the driver double fare to urge the horse through the flooded gutters of the Strand, and he brings with him a matter which he believes defies the ordinary laws of nature." "How on earth can you know all that from the ring of a bell?" I asked in mild astonishment, rising from my chair. The haste of the bell pull spoke of official agitation, while the distinct rhythm of the cab's iron-shod wheels belonged to the heavier 4-wheelers stationed near Waterloo Station, Holmes replied, a faint smile touching his thin lips. "Furthermore, Gregson is the only officer in the Metropolitan Force who wears double-soled provincial boots with steel heel plates, an enduring habit from his early days in the Hampshire Constabulary. But let us hear what brings him to us on such a tempestuous evening." The door flew open, and Inspector Tobias Gregson strode into the room. He was a tall, flaxen-haired man with a shrewd but conventional countenance, clad in a heavy Inverness cape that dripped a veritable cascade of water onto Mrs. Hunson's clean linoleum. His face was flushed, his collar wilted with moisture, and his gray eyes shone with that mixture of professional urgency and suppressed bewilderment that I had come to recognize whenever the authorities found themselves out of their depth. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Good evening, Dr. Watson," Gregson exclaimed, peeling off his sodden pigskin gloves and tossing them onto the edge of the side table. "I must ask you both to put on your heaviest mackintoshes and accompany me without a moment's delay." There is a special train leaving Waterloo for Richmond in 25 minutes, arranged by order of the Home Office, and if we miss it, we shall lose the finest puzzle that has crossed my desk in 15 years of service." Holmes set aside his test tube, capped his spirit lamp with an ivory snuffer, and rose to his feet with that swift feline grace that always surprised those who saw him only in his contemplative moods. "A puzzle, Gregson? You know my weakness. Has someone stolen the crown jewels, or has a respectable banker vanished into thin air?" "Neither, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, leaning forward and resting his knuckles upon our center table. "It is murder, and an impossible murder at that. Professor Thaddeus Vance, the director of the Richmond Royal Observatory on the crest of Richmond Hill, was found dead 2 hours ago in his private dome. His body lies at the base of his great equatorial telescope." "Vance!" I exclaimed, recognizing the name immediately. "The celebrated spectroscopist. Why, he only recently published his monumental monograph on the solar corona and the gaseous composition of the nebulae. He was regarded as one of the foremost optical physicists in England." "The very same, Doctor," Gregson said grimly, "a man of 60, respected throughout the scientific academies of Europe. But it is not merely his death that baffles us. It is the room. The observatory is a circular tower standing upon the roof of the main stone building, 40 feet above the terrace. The only entrance is a single door of solid 2-inch English oak, which was bolted on the inside with a 4-inch wrought iron drop bar. The 4 observation windows are screwed down with rusted brass fittings that have not been loosened since the great comet of 1882. The revolving copper dome above was closed, save for an 8-inch observation aperture through which the telescope protrudes. And yet, Professor Vance was struck down by a poisoned bodkin or pin thrust into his left neck while he sat at his calculations. Holmes's eyes flashed with that keen, incisive light that always appeared when an intellectual challenge presented itself. He reached for his pipe and pouch, thrusting them into the deep pocket of his ulster. "A locked room upon a rooftop," Holmes murmured softly, his long fingers drumming a tattoo against his chin. "And the weather, Gregson? The storm that has battered London today, did it reach Richmond?" "It broke over the hill shortly before midnight last night, Mr. Holmes, with such violence that the gardeners tell me the gravel paths were washed down into the Thames like riverbeds. It poured until 8 this morning, without a minute's pause. The entire terrace surrounding the tower was a foot deep in swirling water." "Capital," Holmes whispered, seizing his deerstalker and tossing my mackintosh across to me. "A sealed chamber, a tempest, and a dead philosopher whose gaze was fixed upon the heavens. Come, Watson, let us see what the stars have to say to Tobias Gregson." Chapter 2. The Barred Dome. The journey to Richmond was accomplished under a gloom that seemed to thicken with every mile south of the river. The special train rattled through the drenched suburban outskirts, water streaming across the carriage glass in gray, distorted ribbons that obscured the flickering gas lamps of the quiet stations. Holmes remained huddled in the corner of his seat, his hat pulled low over his forehead, his keen profile outlined against the dark window pane, lost in silent calculation. He took from his pocket a small notebook and began jotting down a series of figures relating to the speed of falling raindrops, the barometric variations recorded in the evening papers, and the mechanical advantages of various pulley systems. "You see, Watson," he remarked, as the train rumbled over the iron bridge at Barnes, "the concept of the impenetrable chamber is an illusion created by human indolence. A room appears sealed only because the observer limits his imagination to the ordinary channels of ingress, the door and the window. But a building is a three-dimensional geometric structure surrounded by atmosphere. It has vents, conduits, drainage channels, and lines of sight. When a man is found dead behind a bolted door, our first duty is not to marvel at the miracle, but to ask, What path did energy take to enter, and what physical trace did it leave behind? Nature never acts without leaving an indelible record of her passage. Yet a solid oak door, barred on the inside, presents a formidable obstacle to physical ingress, I ventured to suggest. A door is merely a barrier of timber and iron, Holmes replied, gazing into the darkness of the carriage. If a human being passed through it, the timber must bear his mark. If he did not pass through it, then the room was not entered through the doorway at all, and the bolt was either thrown from without by mechanical ingenuity or manipulated after the departure of the assailant. In every locked room problem, the investigator must first separate the physical fact of the lock from the psychological impression of impossibility that the perpetrator intended to produce. The criminal who constructs a sealed chamber is always an artist who desires an audience. He leaves his signature in the very perfection of his design. When at length our cab climbed the steep ascent of Richmond Hill, the rain had diminished to a fine penetrating drizzle that hung like a silver veil over the dripping oaks of the park. The Royal Observatory rose against the sodden night sky like an ancient fortress, a massive square structure of Portland limestone, erected in the reign of King George III for the observation of the transit of Venus, and surmounted at its eastern corner by the circular copper-clad dome of the great equatorial telescope. A pair of oil lanterns flickered at the wrought iron carriage gates, where two uniformed constables stood guard, with glistening capes, their lanterns throwing long, yellow beams across the drenched gravel. We were admitted immediately by a pale, trembling porter, whose teeth chattered audibly in the damp air. Gregson led the way through a cavernous entrance hall lined with grandfather regulators, glass display cases containing antique astrolabes, quadrants, and brass sidereal clocks, whose rhythmic ticking echoed like footsteps in a vault. The air within the building was heavy with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and the cold, mineral dampness of stone walls that had absorbed a century of English rains. We mounted a spiral staircase of cold limestone that wound upward through the core of the building, passing the silent library on the first floor and the private apartments of the resident staff, emerging finally upon a narrow timber landing on the roof level. Before us stood the door of the observatory. It was a formidable slab of seasoned oak, bound with iron strap hinges and studded with broad-headed blacksmith's nails. The door stood slightly ajar now, its lock intact, but the heavy wrought iron drop bar that had secured it lay upon a wooden stool nearby, where the police had placed it after forcing an entry through the upper panel. "Observe, Holmes," Gregson said, pointing to a neat rectangular aperture cut through the 3-inch oak planking just above the bar. When the assistant, Mr. Julian Mercer, came to call the professor at 9 this morning, he could obtain no answer. He looked through the keyhole, but the key was not in the lock. He then summoned the mechanics from below. They brought a brace and saw, cut this small inspection hole through the wood, reached an arm inside, and lifted the iron drop bar out of its heavy steel staples. The bar was seated 2 inches deep in both sockets. No man could have reached that bar from the outside without cutting the wood, and the sawdust upon the floor inside proves that our men were the first to touch it. Holmes knelt upon the threshold, taking his pocket lens from his waistcoat. He examined the oak frame, the floorboards around the door, and the interior face of the heavy iron bar with the minute attention of a naturalist inspecting a rare specimen. He spent 3 full minutes peering at the steel staples into which the bar seated, shining his pocket electric lamp upon the smooth metal surfaces. No levers, no wedges, no signs of mechanical tampering, Holmes murmured to himself. The wood around the bolt is unmarked. The iron bar dropped into its sockets under the influence of gravity alone. It was indeed secured from within. He rose, stepped over the threshold, and gestured for us to follow. The interior of the observatory was a magnificent circular chamber, some 25 feet in diameter. The walls were lined with polished mahogany wainscoting to a height of 6 feet, above which the ribbed hemisphere of the copper dome curved upward toward the zenith. In the center of the floor stood a massive brick pier, isolated from the rest of the flooring by a 2-inch gap filled with horsehair packing to eliminate all terrestrial vibration, upon which was mounted the great 12-inch Cooke refractor telescope. The immense brass tube, gleaming dully in the light of our lanterns, was balanced upon its counterweighted German equatorial mount, its long barrel angled steeply toward the narrow shutter opening in the roof. Beneath the eyepiece of the great instrument, slumped forward over a mahogany observation desk, lay the body of Professor Thaddeus Vance. He was an elderly gentleman with a fringe of snow-white hair and a face that in life must have possessed a severe and commanding dignity. He was dressed in a dark green velvet smoking jacket over an evening shirt and black trousers, with soft Moroccan leather slippers upon his feet. His right arm hung limply toward the floor, while his left hand remained clenched upon a scattered sheaf of logarithmic calculations. Holmes stepped lightly across the cedar boards, his keen eyes scanning every square foot of the chamber before approaching the deceased. He bent low over the body, sniffing the collar of the velvet jacket with obvious interest. "A puncture wound, Watson," Holmes observed, pointing with his long forefinger to a minute, discolored spot beneath the left ear, where the skin had turned a mottled, purplish black. "The skin is swollen, with a distinct ring of subcutaneous extravasation. What do you make of that, Doctor?" I knelt beside him and examined the mark with professional scrutiny. "The aperture is scarcely larger than that of a darning needle or a fine dissection pin," I said. "The margins of the puncture are necrotic, and the surrounding capillaries are completely coagulated. Notice the profound postmortem rigidity in the facial muscles and the cervical spine, while the extremities remain comparatively flaccid. That, coupled with the faint distinctive odor of bitter almonds and crushed almond blossom, points to a violent neurotoxin, either a concentrated curare alkaloid or an anhydrous hydrocyanic preparation. Death must have supervened within 3 to 5 minutes of inoculation, producing an overwhelming paralysis of the respiratory centers, while the higher cerebral faculties remained agonizingly conscious." "An agonizing end," Holmes said softly, his brow furrowing. He was seated here at his desk, peering through his eyepiece, his pen in his hand, when the blow was struck from behind. Notice that his pen lies upon the mahogany desk, having left a single elongated blot of ink where it rolled from his failing fingers. There was no struggle. No chair was overturned. No paper was disturbed. "And look at the windows, Mr. Holmes," Gregson remarked with a triumphant gesture toward the perimeter of the room. There were 4 small circular windows, glazed with thick ship's plate glass, set into the stone walls at cardinal points. Each was fastened from the inside with 3 heavy brass butterfly screws, coated in a fine, undisturbed patina of gray dust and cobwebs that proved they had remained undisturbed for months. "The windows have not been opened for a decade," Holmes agreed. "And the ceiling shutter?" He looked up at the slit in the copper dome. The shutter was an 18-inch opening that ran from the horizon to the zenith, operated by a system of endless chains and iron pulleys. It was open approximately 12 inches, permitting the brass snout of the refractor to point out into the black night sky. "The shutter is open, of course," Gregson said, for the professor was observing until late into the night. "But the dome is 40 feet from the ground, surrounded by a sheer wall of dressed Portland stone. No man could fly through an 18-inch slit in a copper dome without wings, Mr. Holmes." "Man cannot fly, Gregson," Holmes said quietly, "but man can climb, and man can plan. Let us see what the sky has to tell us." Chapter 3. The Iron Downspout. Sherlock Holmes did not immediately examine the dead man's papers, or search the pockets of his velvet jacket. Instead, he walked slowly around the central brick pier, his gaze fixed upon the floorboards. He took out his magnifying glass once more, dropping onto his hands and knees to inspect the circular cedar planks between the observation desk and the northern wall. "A curious floor," Holmes remarked. "Cedar of Lebanon, unvarnished, scrubbed with dry sand, according to the best traditions of optical observatories, in order that no volatile varnishes might condense upon the objective lens. Such wood is extraordinarily sensitive to moisture and physical abrasion." He paused, shining his lamp horizontally across the planks. "Look here, Watson. What do you see?" I peered over his shoulder. In the oblique beam of light, I could discern 3 faint circular indentations upon the pale cedar wood, spaced about 4 inches apart, approximately 6 feet to the north of the observation chair. "They look like small, round depressions," I said, "as if a heavy tripod or a metal-tipped rod had rested there." "Or the steel ferrule of an instrument," Gregson suggested. "Hardly an instrument," Holmes said, shaking his head. "The marks are irregular, and if you look closely at the center of each depression, there is a minute trace of reddish-brown grit. It is brick dust, mixed with pulverized slate and old lime mortar. Now why should brick dust appear upon the cedar floor of an observatory that stands upon a stone tower?" "Could it have been brought in on the boots of the staff?" I asked. "The staff wears soft felt slippers within the dome, as required by observatory regulations," Holmes replied. "Furthermore, the brick dust is fresh and unbrowned. It fell from a height of several feet. It came from a man's clothing." Without waiting for further conjecture, Holmes walked to the north wall, where a small timbered doorway, scarcely 4 feet high, gave access to the narrow exterior lead gutter that encircled the base of the copper dome. He unlatched the low door and stepped out onto the roof terrace into the cold night air. Gregson and I followed close behind him. The rain had ceased entirely now, though the night wind blew wet and chilly off the Thames Valley below. From our elevated position, the lights of Richmond and the distant, murky glow of London appeared as faint smudges against the horizon. The lead gutter upon which we stood was approximately 2 feet wide, bounded on the outer edge by a stone parapet 18 inches high. Holmes moved along the lead flat with the eagerness of a hound on a fresh scent. He stopped at the northwest corner of the tower, where the stone parapet was broken by an ornamental gargoyle and a heavy cast-iron rainwater hopperhead, from which a 4-inch downspout descended vertically down the sheer face of the stone tower, to the terrace 40 feet below. "Here is the natural drainage of the roof," Holmes said, leaning over the parapet and training his lantern down the length of the iron pipe. "Observe the construction, Watson. It is an old Victorian pipe of heavy cast iron, secured to the limestone masonry every 6 feet by massive wrought iron stay brackets with leaded lugs." "You don't mean to suggest that someone climbed that pipe in the middle of last night's gale?" Gregson exclaimed in disbelief. "Why, it was raining cats and dogs. The water would have been gushing down that hopper like a mill race. A man would have been swept off like a fly." "On the contrary, my dear Gregson," Holmes replied, his voice vibrating with suppressed excitement. "The storm was not an obstacle to the climber. It was his greatest ally. It provided him with 3 essential conditions: the roaring of the wind to drown any sound of his ascent, the torrential downpour to wash away all traces of his approach across the terrace gravel, and the certainty that all honest folk would be safely huddled by their fires indoors." Holmes pointed his electric lamp directly into the mouth of the iron hopperhead. "Look at the upper rim of the lead hopper. The dark oxidation of the lead has been freshly scraped away in 2 distinct notches, exposing the bright, silvery metal beneath. Those notches correspond precisely to the width of a pair of steel climbing irons, such as are used by telegraph linesmen or alpine climbers. And look here, upon the stone corbel immediately beneath the parapet." He indicated a sheltered recess of the limestone masonry directly beneath the overhanging stone cornice. While the surrounding stone was dark and sodden from the hours of driving rain, a distinct semicircular patch of stone, roughly 14 inches across, remained dry and dusty. "A dry shadow," I observed. "Precisely, Watson," Holmes cried. "A dry shadow upon a wet wall is the most eloquent witness in the world. When the southeasterly gale was at its height, between midnight and 1 in the morning, a man was crouching here beneath the cornice for a period of at least 10 to 15 minutes. His broad back and heavy oilskin coat shielded this precise patch of stone from the driving sleet. He waited here until the astronomer's lamp was extinguished, or until he had composed himself for the final act." "Granting he climbed the pipe, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, scratching his head, "how did he get into the room? The door from this lead flat into the dome was locked on the inside, and the only other opening is the shutter slit 40 feet above the ground, where the telescope sticks out." "Let us look at that shutter slit from out here," Holmes said. He scrambled onto the curved copper roof of the dome with an agility that made my heart leap into my throat. Grasping the ribbed copper seams with his hands, he edged himself upward until he stood beside the open 18-inch aperture through which the brass snout of the Cook refractor protruded into the night. Holmes shone his lantern into the narrow gap between the brass barrel of the telescope and the copper casing of the shutter. He bent his head, inspecting the iron guide rails upon which the shutter rolled. A slender man, unencumbered by a coat, could easily slide his body through an 18-inch gap, Holmes called down to us, especially when the great telescope itself provides a convenient brass pillar to grasp. But what did he do once he was inside? And how did he leave the room barred behind him when he departed? Holmes reached into the dark recess between the shutter rail and the mahogany lining, his long fingers probing the iron counterweight mechanism. When he drew his hand back into the lantern light, he held a minute fragment of something between his thumb and forefinger. It was a piece of fine, semi-transparent cord, scarcely 3 inches long, frayed at one end, and coated in dark lubricating grease. "What is that, Holmes?" I asked. "A strand of high-tensile silkworm gut, Watson," he answered, his eyes gleaming. "The very material used by salmon fishermen for their finest casting traces, and by surgeons for internal ligatures. A thread of immense strength, virtually invisible in the dark, and capable of slipping around an iron bolt without leaving a mark on the timber. The mechanism of our locked room begins to show its contours." Chapter 4. The Geometry of the Heavens. We return to the interior of the observatory, closing the low exterior door behind us to shut out the damp night wind. Holmes immediately went to the mahogany observation desk and began a systematic examination of the papers and instruments that lay before the dead astronomer. Professor Vance sat as if frozen in the act of contemplation. His right hand lay near a heavy brass-bound notebook labeled Sidereal Journal, Autumn 1891. Beside it rested a circular brass micrometer, a box of ivory-handled ruling pens, a bottle of permanent carbon ink with its stopper removed, and a half-emptied cup of black coffee that had grown cold and formed a pale, wrinkled skin across its dark surface. Holmes did not disturb the body, but bent over the open page of the journal, bringing his magnifying glass within an inch of the freshly inked paper. "Here is the record of his night's work," Holmes said, reading aloud the neat, spidery script. "November 17, 10:45 p.m. Atmospheric turbulence severe. Seeing 2 on the scale of 5. Calibrating the photographic spectroscope upon the binary system in Cygnus. Right ascension 21 hours, 18 minutes. Declination plus 45 degrees, 12 minutes. Holmes paused, his finger tracing down the page. 11:30 p.m. Cloud cover advancing rapidly from the south. The storm breaks, adjusting the equatorial drive to compensate for wind vibration. The calculations of the orbital period are complete. The fraud is proven beyond all scientific disputes. I shall lay the entire correspondence before the Council of the Royal Society on Thursday." "A fraud?" Gregson exclaimed, his eyes widening with intense interest. What fraud could he mean? "That is what we must discover," Holmes replied. "Notice that after the word Thursday there is a sudden jagged line, where the pen slipped across the paper, trailing off toward the bottom right corner of the sheet. The clockwork drive of the telescope was running, but look at the setting circles upon the brass mounting of the instrument. Holmes stepped onto the raised iron platform that encircled the brick pier. He held his lantern close to the silvered vernier scales that recorded the precise orientation of the 12-inch refractor. Here is the hour circle. Right ascension 21 hours, 38 minutes. And here is the declination circle, plus 48 degrees, 22 minutes. Watson, you are familiar with the rudiments of astronomy. Does that position correspond with the binary star in Cygnus, mentioned in his journal? I believe Cygnus would have been considerably lower in the western sky by midnight, I replied, searching my memory of our amateur stargazing evenings. At 48 degrees north declination and nearly 22 hours right ascension, the telescope is pointed toward a region near the border of Cepheus and Lacerta. Precisely, Holmes said, a region known to astronomers as the Northern Coal Sack, a dark nebula composed of interstellar dust, where neither star, nor planet, nor comet of any brightness is visible to human optics. Why should a master spectroscopist, in the midst of a violent gale, turn a 12-inch telescope away from his research object and lock the equatorial clamps upon a patch of total, impenetrable darkness? Perhaps he was startled by his attacker and struck the tube as he fell, Gregson suggested. Look at the heavy brass locking clamps, Gregson, Holmes said, tapping the massive, knurled thumbscrews upon the declination axis. They are screwed down with such force that I can scarcely budge them with my thumb. Vance did not accidentally knock this great instrument. He deliberately swung its 300-pound barrel to this precise azimuth and elevation, tightened both brass clamps with his own fingers, and locked the clockwork drive. Could he have seen something in the clouds? I asked. Through an 18-inch slit during a torrential downpour? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. When a dying man performs an action that requires physical exertion and deliberate calculation, he does so with a purpose. He knew he was stricken. He felt the venom freezing his blood. He had no time to write a name, for his fingers were already failing him. But he had at his command an optical pointer 40 feet long, capable of recording an angle to the fraction of an arc-second. Holmes stepped to the ocular end of the telescope. He removed his hat, bent down, and applied his right eye to the brass eyepiece. He turned the fine focusing wheel slowly back and forth. Total darkness, of course, Holmes murmured. The sky tonight is covered with dense stratus clouds at 500 feet. We see only the gray underbelly of the London fog. But tomorrow, Watson, when the morning sun rises over Richmond Hill, we shall look through this tube once more. And I venture to predict that we shall find that Professor Vance was looking not at the heavens, but at the earth. Holmes turned away from the telescope and addressed Gregson. Tell me, Inspector, who were the inmates of this establishment last night? The household is small, Mr. Holmes, Gregson replied, consulting a black leather notebook. Besides the professor, there are only 3 persons who reside upon the premises or have regular access to the observatory tower. First, Mr. Julian Mercer, the resident assistant astronomer, a young gentleman of 28, a Cambridge wrangler, who has lived here for 3 years, assisting the professor with his photographic plates. Second, Sir Arthur Calderwood, the chairman of the board of trustees of the observatory, a wealthy city merchant and amateur astronomer, who maintains a private suite of rooms on the first floor of the main building. Third, Mr. Reginald Croft, the master optical craftsman and mechanician, who occupies the ground floor workshop, where the observatory lenses and clockwork drives are manufactured and repaired. All 3 were in the building last night when the storm broke. Excellent, Holmes said, rubbing his hands together. A mathematician, a financier, and a mechanician. Between the 3 of them, they should possess all the knowledge required to build a locked room and scale an iron downspout. Let us make their acquaintance without delay. Chapter 5. The 3 Men of Science. We descended the stone spiral staircase to the ground floor, where the main library of the observatory offered a more hospitable setting. A massive coal fire roared in the stone grate, casting long, dancing shadows across shelves laden with leather-bound scientific folios, rows of brass sextants, and delicate glass models of planetary orbits. The air in the room was heavy with the aroma of dried tobacco, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar shavings from the workshops beyond. Seated before the fire were the three men of whom Gregson had spoken. As we entered, they rose to their feet, each presenting a study in contrasting human temperament under the stress of sudden tragedy. Julian Mercer, the assistant astronomer, was a man of slight, almost frail physique, with a pale, intensely intellectual forehead, hollow cheeks, and dark, restless eyes that darted nervously from Holmes to Gregson. His fingers, long and thin like those of an artist, were heavily stained with nitrate of silver and pyrogallic acid, the unmistakable mark of a photographer who spent 16 hours a day handling wet collodion plates in the cold darkrooms of the tower. He wore a threadbare frock coat that hung loosely upon his narrow shoulders, frayed at the cuffs and buttoned haphazardly, as though the wearer had forgotten the existence of the physical world in his devotion to the stars. His lips twitched with an uncontrollable nervous tremor, and a thin, damp film of perspiration glistened upon his temples, despite the droughty chill of the library. Beside him stood Sir Arthur Calderwood, a florid, broad-shouldered gentleman of 55, dressed in immaculate evening attire, with a heavy gold Albert chain draped across his expansive waistcoat. His mutton-chop whiskers were neatly brushed, his linen was of the finest Irish cambric, but his ruddy face was congested with irritation and an anxiety that he struggled in vain to conceal beneath an air of pompous authority. He stood with his back to the hearth, his feet planted wide apart upon the Persian rug, clutching a gold-headed cane with a grip so tight that his knuckles showed mottled white against the polished wood. At the edge of the hearth sat Reginald Croft, the mechanician. He was a powerfully built man of 40, with thick, muscular forearms exposed by his rolled-up shirt-sleeves, a square jaw, and keen, steady gray eyes. His hands were calloused and blackened with machine oil, optical rouge, and emery powder, and he looked upon the assembly with the calm, detached scrutiny of a craftsman accustomed to dealing with unyielding physical materials, rather than the volatile passions of men. "I must protest most vigorously, Inspector Gregson," Sir Arthur began, in a booming voice that echoed against the vaulted ceiling as we entered. "It is an outrage that we should be detained in this room like common felons. The death of my distinguished colleague Professor Vance is an appalling calamity for the nation, but to suggest that anyone within these walls could have had a hand in it is utterly preposterous. The man was locked in his own observatory. If he met his death by some misadventure, some sudden cardiac seizure, or an inexplicable optical accident—" "It was neither misadventure, nor seizure, nor accident, Sir Arthur," Holmes interrupted quietly, stepping forward into the firelight and removing his wet gloves. "Professor Vance was murdered by the introduction of a potent neurotoxin into his neck, delivered by a fine steel point while he was seated at his telescope." Mercer let out a sharp, gasping breath and sank back into his armchair, burying his face in his stained hands. "I knew it," he whispered in a voice scarcely audible above the crackle of the coals. "I knew there was something terrible in that room when he did not answer my knock." The silence was not the silence of sleep. Holmes fixed his piercing gaze upon the young assistant. "You were the first to raise the alarm, Mr. Mercer?" "I was, sir," Mercer replied, looking up with haunted, bloodshot eyes. "It was my duty to relieve the professor at 6 in the morning to develop the stellar spectroscopic plates taken during the night. When I mounted the stairs, the door was barred. I called to him repeatedly, but there was no sound from within. I assumed he had fallen asleep from exhaustion, as he often did during long observing sessions. But when 9 o'clock struck and he still did not appear. I became alarmed, and summoned Mr. Croft with his tools. "And you, Mr. Croft," Holmes said, turning to the mechanician. "It was you who cut the panel in the door." "It was, sir," Croft answered in a deep, level voice, devoid of all theatricality. "Mr. Mercer came running down to my shop in a state of great distress. I took a 2-inch center bit and a keyhole saw from my bench, mounted to the roof landing, and examined the door. The key was not in the keyhole. I bored a hole 3 inches above the lock, through which I could see the heavy wrought iron drop bar seated firmly across the lintel. I cut a clean square section through the seasoned oak, inserted my arm to the elbow, and lifted the bar out of its heavy steel staples. The iron was resting squarely 2 inches into both wall brackets. There was no earthly way to reach that fastening from the landing without cutting through the wood, and the fresh cedar sawdust scattered below the cut showed plainly that no tool had touched the door before mine. "You are familiar with the mechanism of the dome and its shutter, Mr. Croft?" Holmes asked, pacing slowly toward the craftsman. "I built them both with my own hands, Mr. Holmes," the craftsman replied with a touch of professional pride. "The dome weighs 6 tons of sheet copper on an angle iron framework. It rolls on 12 chilled iron ball bearings in a turned steel track. It is so perfectly counterbalanced that a child of 10 could turn it by the hand wheel. The shutter is an 18-inch opening, raised by an endless bronze chain operating a worm gear at the zenith. It was open 12 inches when I entered, exactly as the professor liked it for stellar work." Holmes inquired. Croft frowned, considering the question with practical seriousness. He might climb the Iron Downspout at the northwest corner if he had the nerve of a steeplejack and the strength of an alpine guide. "The brackets are forged iron, leaded into the limestone every 6 feet. But why should any man risk his neck on an iron pipe 40 feet above the terrace in the middle of a torrential gale, when the front door of the building was unlocked all night?" "The front door was unlocked?" Holmes asked sharply, turning to Gregson. "It was, Mr. Holmes," Gregson admitted, shifting uncomfortably on his heels. "The night porter was asleep in his lodge from 11 until 5, and the outer carriage gates stand open day and night for the convenience of the astronomers who must come and go at all hours of the night, according to the state of the weather." Holmes turned his attention to Sir Arthur Calderwood. "And you, Sir Arthur, where were you during the storm last night?" The baronet stiffened, his face flushing a deeper crimson against his white collar. "I was in my private suite on the first floor, sir. I was occupied until 2 in the morning with the audit of the observatory's financial accounts and correspondence regarding the endowment fund. I heard the wind and the rain roaring against the windows, but I heard nothing else, and I fail to see what right an unofficial investigator has to interrogate a magistrate of the county and a trustee of the Royal Society." "Mr. Holmes acts with the full authority of Scotland Yard, Sir Arthur," Gregson said firmly, "and in a capital charge, social position offers no exemption from inquiry." "Then let him look into the deceased's private affairs," Sir Arthur snapped, his voice rising in anger, his cane striking the hearth fender with a sharp metallic clatter. "Professor Vance was a brilliant observer, but an impossible administrator. He was suspicious, secretive, and utterly unmanageable. He had recently accused the entire board of trustees of irregularities in the management of the endowment fund, threatening us with public exposure in the press and a formal parliamentary inquiry." "Indeed?" Holmes murmured, raising his eyebrows in keen interest. "And was there any foundation for his accusations, Sir Arthur?" "None whatever," the baronet declared, though his eyes shifted uneasily toward the carpet. "A mere delusion of an overtired brain. He saw conspiracies everywhere. Why, he even accused poor Mercer here of falsifying spectroscopic data and claiming discoveries that did not belong to him." Julian Mercer sprang to his feet, his pale face suddenly blazing with a mixture of rage and terror. "That is a lie," he cried, his voice cracking with intense emotion. "I never falsified a single line. It was he, He who took my calculations, my years of mathematical labor on the orbital perturbation of the comet, and claimed them as his own. He told me yesterday afternoon in this very room that he would publish the paper under his name alone, and that if I uttered a single word of protest, he would ruin my career in every observatory in Europe, and brand me as an impostor. The young scholar stood trembling in every limb, his chest heaving, before collapsing back into his chair in a paroxysm of weeping, his slender frame shaken by silent sobs. A heavy, suffocating silence fell upon the room, broken only by the steady, unhurried ticking of a brass regulator on the wall, and the crackle of the coal embers. Holmes looked slowly from the weeping assistant to the flushed baronet, and finally to the impassive face of the mechanician. "A rich harvest of motives," Holmes observed quietly to me, "a threatened exposure of financial corruption in the city, an intellectual theft of a lifetime's work, and an open door 40 feet below a barred room. Before we draw any conclusions, let us examine the professor's private study and the mechanician's workshop below." Chapter 6. The Broken Spectroscope and the Missing Folio. Accompanied by Inspector Gregson, Holmes and I ascended to Professor Vance's private study on the second floor, a spacious, book-lined apartment situated directly beneath the observatory dome. The room bore all the hallmarks of a lifelong bachelor devoted exclusively to the rigorous pursuit of abstract science. A large mahogany writing desk stood in the center, flanked by glass-fronted cabinets filled with photographic negatives on glass plates, chemical reagents, and bundles of correspondence tied with red tape. Holmes immediately applied himself to the desk. With swift, methodical efficiency, he sorted through the papers, his keen eyes extracting the essence of each document in a matter of seconds. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, drawing a thick ledger from the central drawer. "This is the financial account of the Observatory Endowment Fund for the past 3 years. Observe these entries in Vance's own handwriting. June 14, 1890. Deficit of £1,200 in the Optical Maintenance Fund, unexplained by trustees. September 22, 1891. Further draft of £3,500 transferred to Calderwood & Co., East India Merchants, without authorization of the Council." "Then Sir Arthur Calderwood was indeed embezzling the funds," I exclaimed. "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "Sir Arthur's firm has been severely shaken by the recent collapse in Argentine securities. He desperately needed capital to cover his margins in the city, and he borrowed from the Observatory Trust, intending no doubt to repay the sum before the annual audit. But Vance discovered the defalcation and was preparing to present this very ledger to the Royal Society on Thursday. That provides Sir Arthur with a motive of £5,000 and the preservation of his social honor." "A formidable motive for murder," Gregson agreed, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "I have half a mind to put the handcuffs on the baronet this very instant." "Gently, Gregson, gently," Holmes cautioned, holding up a warning hand. "A man may be a dishonest trustee without being a rooftop assassin who scales an iron downspout in a gale." Let us look further. Holmes turned to a second pile of papers on the corner of the desk. These consisted of dozens of large sheets of graph paper, covered with intricate mathematical calculations and curves representing the orbits of celestial bodies. "Here is the scientific work of which young Mercer spoke," Holmes said, smoothing out the top sheet. "It is a monumental treatise upon the return of Biela's periodic comet, and its disintegration into a meteor stream. The mathematical analysis is brilliant, far beyond the classical methods of Vance's generation. It bears the unmistakable stamp of the modern Cambridge Analytical School. And look at the title page, The Dynamics of Cometary Dissolution, by Thaddeus Vance, F.R.S. Holmes held the sheet up to the lamplight. The title page has been rewritten on heavy Whitman paper, but if you look closely at the erasure beneath the professor's name, you can still discern the faint indentation of the copperplate script, by Julian Mercer, B.A. Vance had indeed stripped the young scholar of his name and his glory. "The scoundrel!" I could not help exclaiming. "To rob a young man of the one thing he possessed in the world." "Science, like art, has its tragedies, Watson," Holmes said somberly. "And intellectual vanity is often more ruthless than common greed. But look at this third drawer." Holmes pulled open the narrow side drawer of the desk. Inside lay a curious assortment of objects: a velvet-lined case containing several precision dissecting needles, a small glass vial labeled curare, extractum liquidum, more than half empty, and a heavy brass pocket spectroscope with its prism housing shattered as if by a violent blow. "What do you make of that, Holmes?" I asked, pointing to the vial of deadly poison. "The poison was kept in Vance's own desk," Holmes murmured, picking up the vial with a pair of brass tweezers and examining the label. "It is a standard botanical specimen brought by the Royal Society expedition to the Orinoco in 1888, of which Vance was a committee member. Any person who had access to this study could have dipped a steel pin into this vial." Holmes then took up the shattered spectroscope. He held the brass cylinder close to his lens, inspecting the fractured flint-glass prism inside. "The prism was broken within the last 24 hours, Holmes stated. "There is fresh, unoxidized brass filings clinging to the screw threads of the casing. And look at the fracture surface of the glass. It is stained with a minute trace of dark, greasy substance." He brought the fragment to his nose and inhaled deeply. "Machine oil, mixed with optical pitch and graphite," Holmes declared. "The very compound used by Mr. Reginald Croft in his workshop below to polish the prisms of the great spectroscope." Now why should a master optician's polishing paste appear upon a broken instrument in the professor's private drawer? "Let us go down to Croft's workshop and see for ourselves," Holmes said, replacing the shattered cylinder in his pocket. We descended to the ground floor and entered Croft's domain, a cavernous, vaulted chamber smelling powerfully of turpentine, mineral oil, and damp abrasive stone. Around the room stood massive cast-iron lathes, polishing spindles, and heavy wooden grinding basins filled with olive-green optical rouge and diamond powder. On a timber rack against the wall hung dozens of tools: center bits, keyhole saws, brass calipers, and several pairs of forged steel climbing irons used for exterior lightning rod repairs. Holmes walked directly to the tool rack. He examined the climbing irons with his glass, noting that one pair bore faint traces of fresh gray lime mortar upon the leather strapping. Beside the irons lay a large wooden spool wound with several hundred yards of transparent silkworm gut, exactly identical in diameter and tensile quality to the fragment we had recovered from the dome shutter above. "You see, Watson," Holmes whispered, "the instruments of the crime were prepared in this very workshop. Croft had access to them. Mercer had access to them. Sir Arthur had access to them. But tools require an operating mind. We must now turn to the physical laws of the storm to determine who possessed the hand that used them." Chapter 7. The Barometer's Testimony. Holmes did not sleep that night. While Gregson remained in the library below to keep watch over the three suspects, Holmes and I retired to the small meteorological room, situated on the first-floor landing of the tower. It was a narrow, stone-walled chamber, lined with brass instruments, charts of isotherm lines, and recording apparatus of the finest French and English manufacture. The room was equipped with a self-recording Richard Frere barograph, a Negretti and Zambra recording anemometer, a Robinson cup counter, and a series of mercurial thermometers exposed in a white louvered Stevenson screen outside the northern window. Holmes sat before the rotating brass drum of the barograph, which recorded upon a sheet of ruled graph paper the exact barometric pressure for every minute of the preceding 48 hours. The clockwork mechanism inside the drum gave off a delicate, metallic hum that sounded like the heartbeat of the storm itself. Holmes took out his ivory pocket rule and began a series of meticulous measurements, his magnifying glass hovering over the blue ink trace. "Observe the beauty of automated instrumentation, Watson," Holmes said, his eyes tracing the undulating blue line on the chart. "Men may lie, suspects may manufacture alibis, and witnesses may be deceived by the terror of a tempest. But the atmosphere records its own history with incorruptible fidelity. Look at this sudden, precipitous drop in the trace." He pointed his pencil to a sharp, knife-like V-shaped depression on the ruled paper. "Yesterday evening at 11:15 p.m., the barometer stood at 29.85 inches. Between 11:30 and 11:45, it plunged to 29.20 inches, a drop of more than 6/10 of an inch in 15 minutes. That was the arrival of the squall line over Richmond Hill. The recording anemometer shows that the wind velocity reached 55 miles an hour at precisely 11:42 p.m., accompanied by a rainfall rate of 1.5 inches per hour. "A veritable deluge," I remarked, leaning over his shoulder to examine the recording drum. The rain gauge on the roof flat recorded 38 millimeters of precipitation between 11:40 p.m. and 12:40 a.m. Now look at the cessation of the gale. At 1:10 a.m., the wind suddenly veered 4 points to the northwest. The barometric curve rose sharply, and the rainfall diminished to a negligible drizzle. Therefore, if our assassin scaled the 40-foot downspout under cover of the storm, his ascent and descent must have taken place between 11:30 p.m. and 1:10 a.m. Outside of that 80-minute window, a climber on that exposed wall would have been instantly visible from the grounds and audible to the porter. "Can we fix the time of death more closely than that 80-minute interval?" I asked. "We can, Watson, thanks to your own acute observation of the dead man's clothing and the unyielding laws of thermodynamics and evaporation." Holmes rose from the stool and paced the small room, his hands clasped behind his back under his coat-tails, his head sunk upon his chest in deep contemplation. "When we examined Professor Vance's velvet smoking jacket, you will remember that the left sleeve, which lay upon the cedar desk near the open window, was slightly damp, while the right sleeve was bone dry. The hygrometer in the dome records that the relative humidity inside the room reached 95% during the height of the storm at midnight. The rate of moisture absorption in quilted velvet under such atmospheric conditions is a known physical constant. Vance's sleeve could only have absorbed that moisture while the shutter was open and the driving rain was blowing into the aperture. But at 12:30 a.m., the wind shifted 3 points to the north, which would have carried the rain away from the shutter opening." Holmes stopped and turned to me, his gray eyes blazing in the yellow lamplight. "Professor Vance was alive and working at 11:30 p.m. when he wrote his last journal entry. He was struck down between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. at the very climax of the tempest. And during those 30 minutes, where were our 3 suspects?" "Sir Arthur claims he was in his study below," I said. "Mercer claims he was asleep in his attic bedroom across the park. And Croft was in his workshop." "Precisely," Holmes said. "None of them has an alibi that can withstand scrutiny. For in a house where everyone was indoors, listening to the roar of the wind, no man can swear to the presence of another. But there is another witness, a witness that cannot speak until the darkness yields to light. Let us go up to the dome once more." The first pale gray light of dawn was beginning to break in the east when we ascended the stone stairs for the 3rd time. The rain had ceased entirely. The clouds over the Thames Valley were breaking into ragged purple fleets, through which the pale gold of the morning sun began to illuminate the dripping landscape. Holmes entered the observatory, walked briskly to the great 12-inch refractor, and looked through the finding scope attached to the side of the main brass tube. "The clouds are lifting, Watson," he cried. "The horizon is clear. Come here, stand beside me, and look through this eyepiece." I mounted the iron observation steps and applied my eye to the small finding telescope. Through the crosshairs of the optical field, I saw the mist clearing from the green expanse of Richmond Park below. The telescope was angled downward, pointing far below the astronomical horizon. The powerful lenses brought a distant brick building into startling needle-sharp focus. "Why, Holmes," I gasped, "it is not pointed at the sky at all. It is aimed directly at a building across the park." "And what building is it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice ringing with triumph. "It is a small three-story Georgian house on the edge of the common," I replied, adjusting the brass focus ring. "I can see a top-floor dormer window. The curtains are drawn, but on the sill stands a brass photographic printing frame and a row of glass chemical bottles. The lodgings of Mr. Julian Mercer, the dying astronomer, used his last ounce of human strength to turn his 12-inch pointer across 2 miles of space and lay his crosshairs upon the window of his murderer." Chapter 8. The Angle of Declination. Inspector Tobias Gregson had joined us in the dome, his mouth agape as he listened to Holmes's startling revelation. "Julian Mercer!" Gregson exclaimed. "The assistant! But, Mr. Holmes, how could a frail young scholar climb a 40-foot iron pipe in the dead of night?" "You underestimate the physical capabilities of a desperate man, Gregson," Holmes replied, stepping down from the observation platform. Mercer was a noted member of the Cambridge Mountaineering Club during his undergraduate days at Trinity, a fact which he omitted to mention to us, but which is recorded in the university calendar on the library shelf below. His slight build and extraordinary finger strength, developed through years of rock scrambling and handling fragile glass plates, made him an ideal cragsman. But let us reconstruct the crime from its very inception, and you will see how every piece of this intricate puzzle falls into its inevitable place. Holmes walked to the central desk and pointed to the dead astronomer's journal. Yesterday afternoon, Professor Vance confronted his assistant with the stolen comet treatise. Vance, in his overweening vanity, informed Mercer that he intended to publish the work under his own name and threatened the young man with professional destruction if he dared to resist. Mercer realized that his years of labor, his career, and his very livelihood were to be extinguished by an unscrupulous master. He resolved that Vance should not live to see the Royal Society meet on Thursday. Mercer knew the habits of the observatory intimately. He knew that Vance would spend the stormy night alone in the dome, observing the spectroscopic binary in Cygnus. He also knew that Vance always barred the heavy oak door from within, to prevent any interruption during delicate photographic exposures. Mercer prepared his plan with mathematical precision. In the ground-floor workshop, he obtained a length of fine silkworm gut and a pair of steel climbing irons, which Croft used for maintaining the lightning conductors on the roof. He also took from Vance's desk a dissecting needle dipped in the Venezuelan curare. Shortly before midnight, while the gale was raging at its height, Mercer left his lodgings, crossed the park under cover of the storm, and entered the unlatched main hall of the observatory. He ascended to the roof terrace, put on his climbing irons, and scaled the cast-iron downspout at the northwest corner. He reached the lead gutter beneath the dome. As we saw from the dry shadow on the stone corbel, he sheltered there for several minutes, until he saw that Vance was absorbed at the telescope eyepiece. He then climbed the copper dome, using the raised seams as handholds, and slipped his slender body through the 18-inch shutter opening. "And the locked door, Holmes?" I asked. "How was the iron bar lowered into place?" "That was the most ingenious part of his scheme," Holmes said, taking from his pocket the fragment of greasy silkworm gut he had found on the shutter rail. Before he entered the dome through the roof, Mercer had prepared the door. While Vance was down in the library at 10 o'clock taking his tea, Mercer had mounted to the landing. He attached this long strand of silkworm gut to the end of the heavy wrought iron drop bar. He carried the cord up over the top of the oak door, through the narrow ventilation slit above the lintel, out onto the lead gutter, and up to the copper dome shutter. He propped the iron bar in a precarious, near-vertical position against the doorframe. held from falling into its sockets by the tension of the cord. When Mercer climbed through the shutter into the dome at midnight, he approached Vance from behind. With the swiftness of an expert anatomist, he drove the poisoned needle into the nerve center beneath the professor's left ear. Vance was paralyzed almost instantly. Mercer then searched the desk for the original Comet manuscript, but could not find it, for Vance had locked it in his private safe below. Hearing Vance gasp his last, Mercer scrambled back out through the 18-inch shutter slit onto the copper roof. Once outside upon the lead flat, Mercer took the end of the silkworm gut, gave it a sharp, steady pull, and the heavy iron bar was jerked from its precarious balance, falling squarely into the steel staples with a dull thud that was swallowed by the roar of the tempest. Mercer then gave the cord a final violent yank. The fine gut snapped at the knot, slipping smoothly out through the ventilation slit above the door, without leaving a trace upon the oak. He slid down the iron downspout to the terrace, relying upon the torrential cloudburst to wash away his footprints and the brick dust from his boots, and returned to his lodgings to await the morning. "Magnificent!" Gregson cried in genuine admiration. "It is as clear as day. But how did Vance manage to point the telescope at Mercer's window?" That was the one factor upon which the murderer had not calculated, Holmes answered solemnly. Curare paralyzes the voluntary muscles, but it leaves the intellect clear until the final cardiac arrest. Vance felt the icy numbness creeping through his veins. He could not speak, he could not walk, his fingers could no longer grasp a pen, but his right arm still possessed enough motor power to operate the fine adjustment wheels of his beloved instrument. With his dying breath, Vance hauled himself up to the brass controls. He knew the terrestrial coordinates of Mercer's lodgings across the park, for he had often used the distant dormer window as a collimation target to align his optical axes. He spun the hour circle to 21 hours 38 minutes. He locked the declination clamp at plus 48 degrees 22 minutes. He died in the very act of tightening the brass screw, leaving the great Cook refractor as an eternal, incorruptible accuser pointing straight at his murderer's hearth. Chapter 9. The Calculus of Guilt. We descended the spiral staircase to the library, where Sir Arthur Calderwood, Reginald Croft, and Julian Mercer remained under the guard of our constables. The morning sun now flooded the room with brilliant, golden light, illuminating the rows of leather-bound folios, the brass instruments, and the pale, haggard faces of the three men. Holmes walked slowly across the Persian carpet, and stood directly before Julian Mercer. The young assistant sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed, his ink-stained hands clasped tightly between his knees, his entire posture conveying the utter collapse of a soul that had reached the end of its endurance. "Mr. Mercer," Holmes said in a low, compassionate voice, "the storm has passed. The sky over Richmond Hill is clear, and the Cook telescope has delivered its testimony." Mercer did not look up, but a long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, sounding like the rustle of dry autumn leaves. "You are a mathematician, Mr. Mercer," Holmes continued quietly. "You know that in geometry 2 points determine a line, and that a line extended through space must reach its terminus. The optical axis of the great refractor passes through the northwest shutter of the dome, crosses the treetops of Richmond Park, and terminates precisely upon the third-floor dormer window of your lodgings on the Common." Mercer's hands tightened until his knuckles showed white through his skin. "Furthermore," Holmes said, drawing several small objects from his pocket and placing them upon the mahogany table before the young man, "we have found the dry shadow beneath the stone corbel where your coat sheltered the wall, the scratches of your climbing irons upon the lead-hopper head, the strand of silkworm gut in the shutter rail, and the minute traces of red brick dust upon the cedar floorboards of the dome, matching the crumbling chimney mortar of your own roof terrace." Sir Arthur Calderwood sprang from his chair, staring at the assistant with a mixture of horror, outrage, and bewilderment. "Mercer, merciful heavens, Mercer, was it you? You, whom we harbored in this institution for 3 years?" Julian Mercer slowly raised his head. His pale face was tearless now, his dark eyes burning with a strange, tragic serenity that seemed to place him far beyond the reach of human censure. "Yes," he said, his voice steady and clear in the quiet room. "It was I." He looked up at Holmes, a faint, bitter smile touching his thin lips. "You have reconstructed it with dreadful accuracy, Mr. Holmes. Every step, every calculation was as you have described. I did not kill him for money. I have lived on bread and tea for 3 years without complaint, sleeping in a freezing attic, while he dined with ministers and lords. I did not kill him out of common malice. But that work, that cometary dynamical proof, was my life. It was 5 years of mathematical agony, 5 years of peering through cold eyepieces, while my lungs burned and my eyes bled with exhaustion. It was my only title to a name among men of science. When he told me yesterday afternoon in this very library that he had put his name upon the title page and destroyed my original draft, and that he would brand me as a slanderer and an impostor if I spoke, something broke within my brain. I saw that there was no justice in this world for a poor scholar against a man of title and established reputation. I resolved that if he took my scientific life, he should not keep his own. The young man rose to his feet, drawing himself up with a quiet dignity that silenced even the pompous baronet. "I do not regret what I did," Mercer said softly. "I regret only that my mathematics were less complete than his. I forgot that the telescope he taught me to calibrate could be used to measure the coordinates of a crime." Gregson stepped forward, his face grave and solemn, and placed a heavy hand upon Mercer's shoulder. "Julian Mercer, I arrest you in the Queen's name for the willful murder of Professor Thaddeus Vance. You must come with me to the Richmond police station. And as for you, Sir Arthur," Gregson added, turning with stern severity to the trembling baronet, "I must request that you remain in this room under the custody of Sergeant Higgins. The entries in the observatory ledger regarding the draft of £5,000 to Calderwood and Company require an immediate explanation before the magistrates in Bow Street." Sir Arthur sank back into his armchair, his face turning an ashen gray, his bluster completely extinguished. Mercer bowed his head in silence. As the constables led him toward the heavy oak door, he paused upon the threshold and looked back at Sherlock Holmes. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "At least the Royal Society will know that the Biela calculations were mine." "They shall know it, Mr. Mercer," Holmes replied with deep earnestness. "I give you my personal word that your original monograph shall be presented in full before the Council of the Royal Society, and that your name shall stand unblemished in the history of English astronomy." Chapter 10. The Stars Above Baker Street. It was late in the afternoon when Sherlock Holmes and I returned to our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The London fog had rolled in once more from the river, wrapping the street lamps in amber halos and pressing against our window panes like a cold, damp cloth. The city below had sunk into a muffled twilight, through which the distant calls of newsboys and the hollow clopping of horses' hooves echoed like sounds from a sunken world. Mrs. Hudson had laid a fresh fire in our grate, and the dry applewood logs leaped and crackled, casting a warm, ruddy glow over Holmes's violin case, his chemical apparatus, and the untidy stacks of daily journals upon the side table. A tray of hot tea, toast, and cold beef stood upon the sideboard, a welcome sight after 24 hours of cold stone corridors and driving Surrey rain. Holmes had changed into his long purple dressing gown and sat in his armchair, his legs curled under him, his favorite briar root pipe sending blue, fragrant spirals of ship's tobacco smoke toward the ceiling. For more than an hour, he had sat in absolute silence, his hands steepled before his chin, gazing pensively into the glowing embers. "A singular case, Watson," he remarked at length, reaching for the poker to adjust a blazing log. "A case rich in psychological interest, though mechanically straightforward once the physical constants of the storm were established." "I cannot help feeling a profound pity for young Mercer," I said, laying down the evening paper. "He was a man of extraordinary gifts, driven to madness by the cruelty and arrogance of an intellectual thief." "Human vanity, Watson, is the most destructive of all the passions," Holmes said, his voice rich with philosophical melancholy. "Sir Arthur Calderwood stole gold from the observatory chest to save his commercial credit in the city, and the law will deal with him in due course for his financial frauds. But Vance stole something far more precious. He stole the creative soul of a fellow laborer in the vineyard of science. Vance died by the venom of an Orinoco weed, but he had already poisoned the well of truth from which both he and his assistant drank. When a master robs his disciple of the fruits of his genius, he commits an offense against the intellect of mankind." Holmes leaned back in his chair, half closing his eyes, as he watched the smoke drift toward the cornices of our quiet room. "How petty our human rivalries appear, Watson, when viewed against the immense backdrop of the celestial vault. Men scheme and lie and climb drainage pipes in the midnight rain to possess a scrap of parchment or a brief hour of worldly acclaim, while above our heads the great constellations wheel in their eternal silence, indifferent to all our triumphs and our crimes. The light that left the binary star in Cygnus when Vance first pointed his telescope began its journey when the Roman legions were building their wall across Northumberland. What does Cygnus care for the Council of the Royal Society, or the title page of a cometary monograph? And yet, I said, in this terrestrial sphere, justice was done through the very stars Vance sought to possess. "Justice was done through geometry, Watson," Holmes replied, a faint smile touching his features. "In the physical universe, energy cannot be destroyed, and an angle once established cannot be erased. Vance used his dying breath to set an optical vector across the darkness, and that line of light was as fatal to Mercer as the poisoned needle was to the astronomer." He rose from his chair, took up his Stradivarius violin from the table beside him, and drew the horsehair bow across the strings. A soft, melancholic melody, one of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, drifted through the warm room, rising and falling in sweet, sorrowful cadences that mingled with the steady drumming of the autumn rain against the glass. I sat back in my chair, watching my companion's keen profile in the firelight, and thought of the silent dome upon Richmond Hill, where the great brass telescope still pointed through the clearing mist toward the distant heavens, recording the eternal truth that in the geometry of the universe no deed can ever be hidden from the light. And there we leave them, sitting by the hearth in Baker Street, while the London rain falls into the quiet evening. It's a story that stays with you, isn't it? A locked room 40 feet in the air, a climb through a midnight cloudburst, and an astronomer who used his final heartbeat not to cry out for help, but to point a 12-inch lens across 2 miles of darkness, to name the man who took his life. I've been thinking back to that question I asked you at the very beginning, about looking at something ordinary and realizing it was pointing directly at a secret. When you consider Professor Vance's telescope, it wasn't just an instrument of science. It was an unshakable pointer of conscience. It makes you wonder how many things in our own daily lives are pointing quietly toward truths we haven't quite found the courage to look at. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you made of Julian Mercer's choice, and whether you think justice was truly served in the quiet library of Richmond Observatory. I read every single one of your notes, and our community conversations around these stories are my favorite part of Midnight Pages. If this fireside mystery brought a little warmth and intrigue to your evening, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves a classic locked room puzzle. There are many more mysteries waiting in our library, and a new one is always just around the corner. This is David. Good night from Ohio. May your skies be clear tonight, and may every star you look upon be exactly where it belongs.